Welcome to Truth Jihad Radio. I'm Kevin Barrett, looking for truth and talking to really interesting people in the search for it. Today I'm talking to an old friend, E. Michael Jones. He is the editor at Culture Wars. Highly recommended, very much worth reading. He is one of the most eloquent, uncompromisingly honest voices of, what should we call it, mainstream Catholicism, traditional Catholicism, whatever you want to call it. He's a Catholic. We got to know each other over at Tehran, and we admire some of the things we've seen over there. And Mike has a great new piece out on the rise and fall of the new atheism, which is our excuse for this interview. So, hey, let's go for it. Welcome, E. Michael Jones. How you doing, Mike?
Thank you, Kevin. Good to be with you again.
Yeah, it's always great talking with you. And you have other fans in my family. My wife is a big fan of your stuff. So it's interesting. You know, you're not just talking to your fellow Catholics. I think there are a lot of folks who recognize that your perspective is uncommonly well informed.
No, what I've realized over the period of the time that I've been on YouTube is there's kind of worldwide audience out there. And you get all sorts of response from all over the world every time you post something on YouTube. So it's like a whole new ball game from when I started out with the magazine almost 40 years ago.
Yeah, here you are in Indiana, you know, talking to some Catholics out of this location in Indiana, and now you're a worldwide figure. You travel a lot too, don't you?
Yeah. Just I traveled a lot last year. I gave lectures in London and then in Berlin, and then I went to Tanzania and I did a book on Julius Nyerere and the collapse of development economics. And then in the beginning of this year, I was in Tehran for another conference, and then I went to Buenos Aires. And I just collapsed in Buenos Aires. I had to be taken to the hospital, and I haven't gone any place since that time. So, but yeah, there's a lot of traveling.
Well, maybe you better take a rest because we need you. You know,
I've been taking a rest. Believe me, I haven't moved out of South Bend since I got back from Buenos Aires, and I'm enjoying being in South Bend. Believe me.
Okay, well, keep on enjoying it, and let's talk from the comfort of our own homes here about the new atheism. This was the flavor of the month after 9/11. It was incessantly promoted by the usual suspects who control the mainstream media. It was cool to be an atheist because the evil bin Laden and the fanatical Muslims had demonstrated that people who care about God are a bunch of lunatic mass murderers, or so we were told. That was kind of the zeitgeist that was imposed on us post 9/11. And new atheism, of course, is not as intellectually as impressive as one might assume it would be, given its popularity. And you've kind of taken it apart in this new article.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it was a response to fundamentalism, either the Christian homegrown variety or the Middle East Muslim variety. But it was basically, we're going to show these fundamentalists that they don't have an inch of ground to stand on because there is no God. And so they tried to prove that God did not exist. Well, you can't prove that something doesn't exist. That's impossible. But that didn't stop them from trying. And so what we have were basically four guys who decided we're going to show you that we're the boss. But the other thing, I think, what you realized at this point was that in order to do this, they all had recourse to Darwinism. And I think what you saw here was the internal logic of Darwinism, but even bigger than that. Let's say the internal logic of the English ideology working itself out over a period of time, to the point where the people who are now the main proponents of this ideology, which is the philosophical, ideological underpinning of the Anglo-American Empire, that they didn't have to be, there was no necessity for hiding behind fictions, pious fictions anymore. They were just going to flat out tell you what the story was, and the story is atheism. You know, there is no God. And the subtext to that, of course, is if there's no God, we're in charge. And you better do what we say. And I think that's the whole story in a nutshell.
Well, that's kind of how it seems to have evolved from the earlier days of Freemasonry, when the more socially responsible Freemasons, and we're told that many of our founding fathers were that type of person, said that, well, maybe there's a God who started everything, but he took a hike. We're deists, so this God, obviously isn't operating in the world today. So we have to run everything the way a good God would if he still were involved in the affairs of the world, which he isn't. And so that kind of, supposedly socially responsible Freemasonry seems to have evolved into a grotesquely socially irresponsible kind of atheism today, with the neocons being the prime examples of people who are avowedly in service to evil. Is there a kind of a historical trajectory here? We could call it the decline and decadence of this English ideology?
Yeah, I think there is. I mean, first of all, to begin at the beginning, the English ideology began with the Reformation. And the state-of-the-art ideology at that point was magic. No way to get around it. It was John Dee. He was working for Walsingham, who was head of the Elizabethan CIA, and it was magic. It was Neoplatonism. It was Hermeticism, whatever you want to call it. And by the beginning of the 17th century, middle of the 17th century, they were completely discredited. Dee was dead, but Father Mersenne, who was the tutor to Descartes, obliterated Robert Fludd in a debate, and the English were left pretty much naked without any type of philosophical underpinning to what they were doing. It was, in many ways, that was the story of the Reformation. There was no theological underpinning for the Reformation. It was naked theft of church property, but they needed a justification, and they didn't have one until Newton came along. And suddenly with Newton, they had a cosmology and they had a new picture of the universe. And this was a radical reformation of what had gone before. Okay. It was a return to paganism. It was Empedocles. Empedocles said that the world was run by love and strife, two forces combined to give perfect circular motion. Newton was an alchemist, no question about it. He was heavily into the magic tradition. But he disguised it by calling these two terms, love and strife, gravity and inertia. You had the perfect universe now of the pagans, and that meant you weren't supposed to intervene. So capitalism arose, laissez-faire capitalism arose directly out of Newtonian physics, the cosmology behind Newtonian physics, but also Freemasonry. You mentioned Freemasonry. It was an absolutely crucial weapon in the psychological warfare arsenal that England was conducting against Catholic monarchies in France. Newton's protege was a French Huguenot by the name of Desaguliers. Desaguliers took Newtonian physics and put it as the official philosophy of the Reformed Whig Masonic lodges, which he took over in 1721. And they became the weapon that basically overthrew the French monarchy and gave us the French Revolution.
Well, your perspective on the Reformation is interesting. I've talked to Michael Hoffman. He's been on the show a couple of times. He has a slightly different perspective, and he emphasizes that there really was an element of corruption in the church, that including usury, which had already crept into the church, and he sees that as a leading cause of the Reformation.
Yeah, there was corruption in the church. There is always corruption in the church. There's corruption in the church right now. But that doesn't change the fact that the aristocracy in every Reformation country, I'm talking specifically about England and the German principalities, used this corruption as an excuse to steal church property. There's no question about it. Obviously, there was corruption. I deal with this corruption in my book, Barren Metal, A History of Capitalism as the Conflict Between Labor and Usury. The whole Medici family, their involvement in usury, the cardinal's involvement in usury, the papacy of Leo X, who was Lorenzo's son, who said that heard about something Martin Luther, he said it was a quarrel among monks and ignored the whole thing. Yeah, there was corruption, but that doesn't change the fact that the Reformation was based on theft of church property.
And so it lacked any kind of deeper philosophical reason for being, you're saying?
The English Reformation has no philosophical or theological justification whatsoever. There's not one theologian there to talk about it. In Germany, we had Luther, and Luther led proto-German nationalism. He was a writer, he was a theologian, he was a heretic, but he did give some type of theological justification for it. But there was still theft. I mean, basically, Thomas Müntzer, who was the leader of the radical wing of the Reformation that led to the Peasant Revolt, said, you want a comfortable life. He told Luther, you want a comfortable life, so you're going to hand the property over to the aristocrats, and they're going to make you the state church. That's the deal in every Protestant country. In England, there was no theological justification whatsoever. None. Absolutely none.
So how did this go from Christianity of whatever type and however they're talking about it to kind of naked atheism, which is what we're talking about with these new atheists?
Well, the crucial turning point was Darwin, and as I said, there's an internal logic to this that sort of worked itself out. But you had all of these discoveries around the same time. The same year that Darwin's book on species came out, Lyell published a book on the geological record. And suddenly you had this conflict between Genesis and science, let's say religion and science. We had two competing narratives about the origins of mankind. And there was no way to reconcile them. And so basically what happened was an accommodation where science became the validator of what is real and religion became a kind of subjective thing. This is what the German romantics like Schleiermacher, Protestant romantics, basically affected through German idealism. Religion sort of nice thoughts, science is realities.
Well, I think that Darwinism is very much the centerpiece of the aspect of scientific work that we could call scientism, the ideology of science as a kind of substitute religion. And it can be quite fundamentalist for some people. In fact, I had an interesting family gathering this summer in which certain family members became extremely upset that I would even raise any questions about their idea of Darwinism.
Right. Well, what you had is the same thing over again. Newton took physics and used it as a cover to smuggle in a new cosmology. Same thing happened with Darwin, except it was biology, and by biology we're going to use now to smuggle in a new cosmology. All of the new atheists, but especially Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens, all use biology as pseudo-cosmology, and that's where they get in trouble. They get into big trouble in their own in promoting their own arguments, because they're out of their depth. Biology is not cosmology, and most importantly, biology is not metaphysics. Metaphysics is the philosophy of beginnings. It always has to do with God. And these guys are coming in, and it's as if they're, okay, we're asking Mr. Dawkins to talk on North Korea, and he thinks it's in Africa. This is the type of ignorance that dominated this entire discussion. So Dawkins starts off by talking about biology, and then he uses this as a front to talk about cosmology, where it absolutely does not apply. He doesn't know what he's talking about.
Well, the connection there, of course, would be that the people who used Darwin, including Darwin himself, I suppose, to try to denigrate the dominant religious ideas of the time, were, of course, going through the deism that said that God was the great watchmaker who set the watch up at the beginning, set it to ticking, and then just disappeared, took a hike. So that lends itself to arguments from complexity, that the incredible complexity of living creatures in particular is evidence for there having been a creator. And then, of course, Darwinism comes in and says, no, you can get the same kind of extreme complexity through this process of complete randomness, which does seem a bit self-evidently bizarre to me, but, there you go.
But you're absolutely right. That was the guy who was the favorite whipping boy of the Darwinists, is a minister, and I can't remember his name right now. The man who, with the analogy of the watch, where you're walking along the beach and suddenly discover a watch, and there's complexity, and therefore from complexity you have to extrapolate to a maker, and therefore the complexity of the universe is proof of the existence of God. He deliberately avoided the real metaphysical issue, which is not about complexity, it's about being. The real issue is being. And the opposite of being is nothing. And this is physics.
Couldn't it be both, though? I mean, I understand your metaphysical argument, or to some extent I do anyway, and that is the main hinge of your article, The Rise and Fall of the New Atheism. But it seems to me that the argument from complexity maybe shouldn't be completely thrown out either. That is...
Complexity and design are a function of purpose.
Yes.
Okay, and purpose is part of what got banned from the universe by Newton, because all motion, according to Newton, is random motion, whereas all motion, according to Aristotle, was teleological, which means every emotion was a form of change, and all change has purpose. If there's no purpose, there's no reason to change. So that's part of the argument. There is an argument about design and complexity, but I'm saying there's a more basic argument, which is basically the metaphysical argument about being. And Daniel Dennett actually jumps in with both feet into exactly where he doesn't want to be when he gives his argument about the universe. Dennett says in his book, the universe created itself ex nihilo, or from something that's really small. I mean, this is preposterous. Okay, let's deal with the second part first. If it created itself from something that's really small, something really small is still something, isn't it? Which means it's not nothing. Okay, which means the universe is already in being. Which means it's false what you just said. But let's take the first part of his statement, which is even more egregiously false from a metaphysical point of view. The universe created itself ex nihilo. That means it had to exist before it existed. You can't create yourself unless you exist, so you have to exist before you existed. That's impossible. So you're giving us an impossible explanation because you can't explain it. The whole revolves around their whole argument revolves around what is a metaphysical absurdity. The universe cannot create itself because to do that, it would have to exist before it existed, and that's impossible.
That's actually a good point, but I could see how somebody on their side, or halfway there anyway, might say, okay, maybe this, you can't say that the universe created itself, but couldn't we say that our complete ignorance about how being emerged from nothingness, or even if it did, or whether maybe there's just always been being, which I think was the philosopher's point that Ghazali was refuting when he was debating with Ibn Rushd. At that time, the philosophers all believed that in a sort of eternal universe, and Ghazali said, no, the religious revelation tells us that there was a creation. And then, of course, today's scientists, with their Big Bang, would actually be leaning towards Ghazali's point of view rather than philosophers. In any case, the point would be that however we enter into this metaphysical discussion, wherever it takes us, couldn't the skeptics rationally say that we don't really know? How can we possibly know how being ever either A, emerged out of nothingness, if there was any nothingness, or B, whether it ever needed to, whether there ever was any nothingness, and whether these aren't just abstractions that we carry around in our own heads?
Well, you're dealing with a crucial moment in Islamic philosophy. Ibn Rushd was confronted with two statements about the universe. The Quran said that the universe had been created, and Aristotle said it was eternal. To say that you don't know, sure, you can say you don't know, but that's not a position. Okay? The two positions he were confronted with, he couldn't resolve. Basically, he could not resolve. And so he said they're both right. He said from the theological point of view, the Quran is right. From the philosophical point of view, Aristotle is right. That's not a solution either. That's a problem. And this allowed the Ash'arites, this began the demise of Islamic philosophy and the rise of the Ash'arites, who said basically Allah is pure will. And we don't, to talk about any type of logos in God is to limit his power, and that's blasphemy. That was the end of Islamic philosophy. Okay? Aquinas dealt with the issue 100 years later. He wrote a book. He wrote a little tract called De Aeternitate Mundi Contra Murmurantes, on the eternity of the world against the murmurers. And he said basically, even if the world were eternal, it had to be created. It had to come into being. So it was a confusion of time and causality. That was the problem that Ibn Rushd could not surmount. So even if it were eternal, it had to come into being. And if it had to come into being, it could not bring itself into being because it had to exist before it existed, and that's impossible. So something else had to bring it into being. Nothing comes from nothing. If there were ever nothing, there could never be something. There is something. Therefore, there was never nothing. This something could not bring itself into existence because it would have to exist before it existed. Therefore, something else had to bring it into existence, and that something is what all men call God.
Of course, that something else, the other side would retort, also had to be brought into existence. And then, of course, we as theists say, no, that's the eternal, uncreated being that we all call God. And they say, well, couldn't you just apply that to the universe, or don't you have the same problem with that? And that's why I don't like to call God a being. In the article, you call God a being. I prefer to call God the source of all being, not a being.
Yeah, you're right. I did leave a step out of that argument. It could be that there was another contingent being that created this contingent being we call the universe, and because that's the experience we have as human beings. I mean, you are a contingent being, and you came into being through your parents, who are also contingent beings. Mm-hmm. But you can't have an unending line of contingent beings. Right. This is what I brought in.
The buck has to stop somewhere.
That's right. I brought in Ed Feser's argument from his book on the New Atheism, where he talks about the caboose. Okay, the caboose is in motion. Why is the caboose in motion? Well, because it's attached to a boxcar. Well, why is the boxcar in motion? Well, because it's attached to another boxcar. Well, at this point, you say, well, is it an infinite line of boxcars? Well, no, because no boxcar has the principle of motion within itself. So there has to be a locomotive, and that's what they would call the uncaused cause or the unmoved mover. The other my analogy is the bridge. Okay, you want to build a bridge, you got to put in a form, and you pump out all the water, and there you find mud at the bottom, and you got to pump that out because mud will move. Okay, you pump everything out until you find something that will not move, bedrock, whatever you want to call it. Okay, at that point you can start building the bridge. Now, if you don't find that, you can have an infinite number of bricks, and you're still not going to have a bridge, because you have to find something that will not move. This is what we call necessary being, and this was also the argument I mentioned in the article as well between Friedrich Copleston and Bertrand Russell that got broadcast on the BBC in 1948. Russell didn't know what to say. He was confounded by the argument, and he said, well, let's change the subject.
Mm-hmm. Which is, of course, the admission of defeat. I like your metaphor about the mud and the bedrock. I think you could use that metaphor not only for the image of constructing a bridge, but perhaps also for the image of constructing a civilization. And today our civilization seems to be increasingly built on mud rather than bedrock. That is, the mud of these confused sorts of ideas rather than the bedrock of a metaphysical truth, which is what great civilizations they always are really built on. It's like in San Francisco today. For a while, we lived in a warehouse that was built on the mud flats of Emeryville, and if that Hayward quake ever comes along with an 8-pointer, probably that whole district is going to be flattened. So I think that we're witnessing the crumbling of Western civilization today precisely because it's more and more being built on that sort of mud of confused speculations and of a lack of that firm metaphysical grounding. Would you agree with that?
And if there's ever an example of philosophical mud, it's Darwinism. And use of Darwinism as a metaphysical principle. It will not work. And so you're right. You're getting to now this, as I mentioned to you earlier, this is the introduction to a book, and the book is called The Logos of the History of Logos and the Logos of History. Because what I'm saying here is we have this worldwide thirst for some type of metaphysical foundation, because it's not there. The dominant Anglo-American Empire, the empire that rules the world right now, has no metaphysical foundation. It's like the bridge with no support. There's nothing there. There hasn't been anything there for 500 years now. Okay, and so you kind of wow people around the world by your technological power, let's say like that classic confrontation at Durman between England and the Mahdi, between the West and the Islamic world in Africa and the Sudan. And basically Kitchener shows up with the Maxim gun and he just mows down the Mahdi's army, which is a bunch of guys on camels waving their scimitars. You don't need an argument after that, do you? Well, yeah, you do. You do. And I think that the admission of this is the way the English promoted Newton and then Darwin, because they need some type of philosophical justification to rule over the rest of us. And all I'm saying here is now, it's not there. There is no foundation. It doesn't work. We need something better, and that's why I'm proposing a return to the metaphysical tradition. God is the fundamental principle of the universe. If you say you're an atheist, okay, you're allowed to say that. The will is free. But you're talking about your own psychological issues and not reality when you make a statement like that.
Well, that's one of the interesting things you raise in the article is the psychological issues behind atheism. But before we go there, I would like to question your assertion that there's been no Islamic philosophy for 1,000 years, because if we try to look at institutional settings where real philosophy is in fact being done and has been done continuously, you could go to Qom Iran. In fact, we have gone to Qom Iran, and you've debated these guys. So I would really question that. I mean, there's been a turn in Islamic philosophy, and there have been all sorts of people that maybe you wouldn't fully agree with who've addressed sort of a different way of seeing things, perhaps, than yours. Ibn al-Arabi and his many followers, Suhrawardi, and all these people that they read in the seminaries in places like Qom. But if you want people doing the kind of philosophy, the metaphysically grounded philosophy, and indeed monotheistic philosophy that you do, you probably couldn't go to a better place than Qom.
Well, I was in Qom, and I had a debate with the mullah about sex, and it got nowhere.
Well, yeah, you're debating sex, but on the metaphysical issues, you're probably in agreement.
It's an issue. No, sex has a metaphysical grounding here. Okay, we're talking about the meaning of sex. I said there's a logos to sex, and the mullah said, once you start a Coke, doesn't mean you have to finish the Coke. And that was the end of our discussion. I'm hoping to provide a basis for a better discussion than that one. That would be okay. To get to your point, though, if you read, and I'm just referring to standard histories of philosophy. Everyone says that Islamic philosophy stopped with Ibn Rushd.
Well, no, that's the Orientalist. That's the Western Orientalist position.
Okay. On the other hand, I do believe that the Ayatollah Khomeini did have recourse to the metaphysical tradition that I'm talking about through Al-Farabi when he created the Valiyat-i-Faqih, which is basically Plato's rule of the guardians. So in that sense, I do believe that it was still active.
Right, he's a product of a huge school that's still functioning. Where is there something like that in the West?
The problem with the West is that there is no West. That's the problem.
Okay.
We have conflict.
Touché. I rest my case.
In a sense, I always get into this argument with people who are talking about the West. Well, what do you mean by the West? It's like talking about white guys. I mean, what are white guy values? Don't know. But I'm saying that there has been nothing but intellectual civil war in the West for at least 500 years, and what we had was the triumph of the people who believed that will was superior to intellect over this course of time, Nietzsche being the prime example. A repudiation of logos in favor of will, and will invariably means the will of the powerful. And that's the philosophy that rules us today. And Darwinism is the best justification of the rule of the powerful.
Absolutely. I think you're right on the money with that. You mentioned the slaughter of the Mahdi and his army by Kitchener and his Gatling guns as a kind of an answer to the people who say that, well, you need some justification. Oh, no, we don't. We've got bigger guns than you do. But in the long run, I think that it's going to be increasingly clear that you do need a justification. We have a great example right now with Trump beating his chest and threatening North Korea, and the limits of that military power are becoming clear because the U.S. is in this position where, despite this huge, expensive military and a lot more nuclear weapons than North Korea has, any attempt to use that force against North Korea would actually decrease the power of the empire, if not actually wipe it out. It's in kind of a Mexican standoff situation.
I agree. You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. You do need a metaphysical justification for what you're doing. And in terms of the technological superiority, it didn't last long anyway. I mean, in that piece I wrote on my visit to Tehran, Kitchener was involved in World War I. And they tried to send the British Navy, the most powerful navy in the world, up the Dardanelles, and they got destroyed. They got obliterated. It turned out that they didn't have such a great technological superiority when it came to weaponry. And Kitchener, who was the hero of Durman, watched those boats go down in the Dardanelles and retired to England a broken man. Mm-hmm. So the technological superiority didn't work, and I think that's the situation we're in right now. I think the whole technological basis for warfare has changed. The tank, it may be obsolete. I mean, remember the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 2006? Hezbollah just stopped them 500 yards into Lebanon. It may be the tank's obsolete.
And how about the ships, the navies?
No, I'm talking about the tank.
Right, but we have it in spades for the navies because they're these new missiles, these fast, these anti-ship missiles.
Sure, what is true of the tank is a fortiori true of the aircraft carrier.
Yeah.
When the Russians fired those cruise missiles into Syria, the first thing that happened was the United States withdrew its aircraft carrier from the Persian Gulf because they don't know. I'm saying, so there's an era of, we're in an era of complete uncertainty in terms of military outcome right now. Yes. It's not Omdurman anymore by any stretch of the imagination. And I'm saying, even if that were the case, you still need some type of metaphysical justification for what you're doing. And it's not there. It's just not there. Mm-hmm. And across the world, we have this now moment where we can talk to people all over the world. English has become the lingua franca. We have YouTube, we have Skype, we have all these technological implements at our hands. And we need something that will allow us to talk in a sophisticated fashion with each other. And that's why I'm embarking upon this project.
Very interesting stuff. Well, in a way, this kind of relates to what Huntington was talking about with the Clash of Civilizations thesis he borrowed from Bernard Lewis, the arch-Zionist from MI6, who was the first guy to talk to Bush after 9/11. And, these guys were predicting that the next round of conflict would be between what they called civilizations, and they said there was, Western Christianity versus Eastern Christianity versus Islam versus Hinduism versus Confucianism, and so on and so forth. But however much we want to ridicule that, and there's a lot to ridicule there, maybe we should admit that they are onto something in the sense that there are these sort of broad civilizational groupings that have been formed by metaphysical truths that reveal themselves slightly differently to different groups of people. And these are what really endures. To the extent that we still have that in the West, I don't know, but we might be seeing a very, very decadent entity that no longer has its metaphysical grounding, trying to impose its superiority on these other entities that may have retained a little bit more of theirs. There's a rebirth of Eastern Christianity in Russia. There's certainly an Islamic rebirth going on around the world. I'm not so sure about Confucianism. I don't know where China's getting its pizzazz, but they've certainly got some. So maybe you could comment on that.
Yeah, I'm proposing something that I consider transcultural. Logos is transcultural.
Yes.
I'm proposing a universal philosophy for all of mankind. What is it? The essence of mankind is logos. It's speech. It's the ability to reason. And I'm saying, based on that, you can come to certain truths that will allow you to order your culture, no matter what your culture is. Okay? I'm trying to avoid this clash of civilization paradigm. I think that there's a unity of civilization paradigm that is based on logos, that's based on human nature as created by God. And that the existence of God is an act of, it can be known by reason. It is not an act of faith to say that God exists. It's an act of reason. Therefore, if you say that God does not exist, you are saying something that is irrational. And at that point, we have to change the focus of the discussion from ontology to psychology, and we have to get into what your issues are. But I'm saying...
Yeah, that's exactly what the Quran says. It's interesting. It's right there in what we Muslims consider the direct word of God. That it's use your reason, and your reason will show you the existence of God. So you're saying that people who deny this are being unreasonable, and therefore they're being driven by irrational motivations, people like these new atheists, and then you're doing a little psychoanalysis on what these motivations might be.
Yes, and it's not my book, although I did have something to do with this book. Paul Vitz wrote a book called Faith of the Fatherless, where he delves into the psychology of famous atheists. I published that first article that was the genesis of that book back in the middle of 1980s when I first met Paul Vitz, when he was just formulating this idea. But I think it's a powerful idea, and the idea is basically that atheism is a function of defective fathers. Now, defective fathers as perceived by the atheist, that we have to add that caveat. All of the famous atheists felt that they had weak fathers. Sigmund Freud is one of the best examples. Sigmund Freud said that God is an exalted father. I think he's right. I think we all get our ideas of God from our fathers. And if you perceive your father as defective, you will have a hard time believing that there is a benevolent God who is the ruler of the universe and the author of creation.
Interesting observation. And that casts some interesting light on the persistent tendency in American popular culture to ridicule fathers. We have these TV shows, kind of culminated, at least, the last thing I've seen along those lines was Al Bundy in that, what was that called? But we have this, Archie Bunker. We have this long list of ridiculous fathers who are basically the butts of humor in American popular culture. Do you think that's linked to this?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely linked to it. And I think, actually, to get back to the new atheism, I think the best explanation of the new atheism is basically this pool of damaged people that are the children of the sexual revolution. The sexual revolution was an attack on the family. It was an attack on fatherhood. I've talked about the Jewish roots of this animus. It's an attack on the logos of the family. The Jews, it's in my book, The Jewish Revolutionary Spirit. Okay? We're talking about over a period of generations now. Once the father abdicates his responsibility as head of the family, which happened during the sexual revolution. I mean, lots of men walked out on their families. You're going to have a pool of people who have grown up with a defective, or an understanding that the father is defective, and therefore psychological problems in identifying with God. I think that's a better explanation of suddenly why this new atheism kind of appeared out of nowhere. Obviously, it's being promoted by the cultural, the oligarchs. This is the way they rule over us. There's no God. There's no moral law. Do what you're told. That's the message of the new atheism. Okay, but you have this pool of people who have been damaged by the sexual revolution and couldn't identify with God psychologically because of their defective fathers.
And you do go into some detail about these specific people. And this does lead me to, step back and consider the possibility that what you're saying actually kind of could tie into a particular anthropology, which we would say that, I forget which famous anthropologist first observed that in every culture they face the same overriding problem, which is what to do with young male sexual energy. That is, the testosterone-crazed people who, adolescent and then for the years after adolescence, those people are so juiced up on their testosterone and so on that they're liable to run out of control and rape and pillage and form gangs and stuff. So they have to somehow be civilized, meaning they have to have their sexuality restricted in such a way that they put all of that energy into protecting and caring for women and children. And if you don't do that, then your people fall apart because it's raping, pillaging, and the war of all against all. So this common human problem leads to the universal human institution of marriage, which is always some kind of trade-off in which men limit and restrict their sexual freedom, despite the instinctive desire to be promiscuous and aggressive, and put all that energy into taking care of women and kids. And we could say that the breakdown that we're seeing around us in this contemporary civilization, with the new atheist being a symptom, might have something to do with this is going wrong. And, whether it's the pill that did it or whether it's the currents of philosophy over the centuries, something has really gone wrong to produce this situation you're describing.
Yeah, I agree. My only caveat about what you said is that it seems to be externally imposed, whereas I'm saying that the logos of sexuality comes from within.
Yeah, I agree. But so does the instinct that it has to restrict.
That's right. I mean, so what I tried to, when I was talking with the mullah in Qom, I was trying to say, well, if a person gets together, a male and female get together and have sexual intercourse over some period of time, chances are there's going to be offspring. And what are you going to do about that offspring? That's part of the plan. And so therefore marriage, in a sense, has to be part of the plan that we're talking about, because otherwise no one's going to take care of of offspring. And if you don't take care of offspring, you're going to have problems. Everybody knows this. Everybody knows this. You'll have this unruly, all of the prohibitions against bastards in law, in English law, in European law, all arose out of this recognition that children have to be raised in a certain way. They arrive helpless. They need both parents there to raise them in a certain way, because if they don't, we're going to have all sorts of social problems. Mm-hmm. Okay? That's more what I would say would be the internal logos of sexuality that has to be implemented in positive law and in social custom. And that's precisely what was overthrown beginning in 1964 by the birth control pill. It began before that, which I deal with in that book, Libido Dominandi, Sexual Liberation and Political Control. But 1964 was what Time magazine called the year of the pill. And at that point, you supposedly disconnected the procreative and the unitive aspects of sexuality, and you created recreational sex for the masses at that point. And that was the beginning of the avalanche that has now led us to homosexual marriage and this whole group of people suffering from anomie, a generation of people suffering from anomie who can't believe in anything.
Well, that's interesting you point to 1964, the year of the pill. That's not what necessarily everybody thinks of when they think of 1964, but you could work that in to the fact that we had a sort of a ritual killing of the good father by the bad father, the good father being JFK, the bad father being LBJ, and of course all the other creeps who worked with him on that. And then we had the beginning of this genocidal mass murder of, some say, as many as 4 or 5 million Vietnamese people. So we had all that stuff happening at the same time. This supposed liberation of the pill comes with the murder of the good father by the bad father, shades of Hamlet, and the beginning of this genocide over in Vietnam, which the good father didn't want.
And the beginning of the rise of Israel as a world power.
Yes, absolutely.
The crucial turning point. Martha Krim was given the American Medal of Freedom by Bill Clinton for basically having sex with Lyndon Johnson, although I'm sure that wasn't the main reason.
Well, I don't know.
Having sex with Lyndon Johnson the night of the Liberty, the Israelis attacked Liberty, the USS Liberty. One of those crucial turning points. John F. Kennedy wanted to prevent the Israelis from getting nuclear weapons. Lyndon Johnson was a total pawn of the Israeli lobby at that point. And the rest, as you and I know, is history, you know?
Yeah, I can see 64 as a moment of things going wrong, which is so much the opposite of what I grew up thinking. As you know, I grew up seeing that Vietnam was horrible and that JFK had been assassinated, but I jumped into this counterculture and assumed that this reaction that we saw in '64 with the hippies and the liberation, and all of that, those were the good guys. And so
Right.
you've kind of been working on curing us of that delusion.
Yeah, well, I've been, as I said many times, I was a guinea pig in an experiment that no one would admit was being conducted on me, not just me, but on our generation. You know, the social engineering of our generation has had catastrophic effects, and it's so catastrophic nobody wants to even talk about it. It's that bad. That bad.
You know, I love talking with you, Mike, because these conversations get ideas going in my head, going off in so many different directions. I can only, grab and channel a couple of them. But let's see. Well, one of them would be to ask whether this generational theory of sociology what are the names of those? There are two sociologists who came up with this Steve Bannon's favorite idea, which is this notion that essentially there's a new generation every 20 years. So every 80 years, you get a total flip-flop of the cycle. And he looks at U.S. history from the Revolution, then 60 or 80 years later, you had the Civil War. 80 years later, you had the World Wars, especially World War II, the culmination. And then 80 years later from that, it's going to be 2020. And Steve Bannon and his cohort, these two sociologists who've developed this theory, and I'm spacing out their names, they say there's going to be an even bigger World War than World War II in about 2020, which is coming up rather soon. And the engine that drives this cycle, according to this theory, is something along the lines of what you're talking about, which is essentially parenting styles that go from more responsible to less responsible to irresponsible, and then the kids of the irresponsible parents end up
it could be
creating a mass slaughter.
Hello?
Yeah. So the children of the irresponsible parents become the generation that creates the mass slaughter, whether it's the Revolution, the Civil War, the World War II, or what they're expecting in 2020.
It could be. I don't know. Time will tell. Well, let's do a show in 2020.
Okay, yeah, let's hope it hasn't happened by then.
If it happens, then we won't do a show.
Then we won't do a show. There you go. Well, here's another big idea that bounces around in my brain while I listen to you, Mike. You mentioned this crucial sort of identification of God and Father in the psychology of children, especially probably male children as they grow up. And there's something to that. And, of course, Christianity really, and Judaism, I suppose, too, take that, really emphasize that. Isn't there also a maternal aspect here? In Islam, the two main words we use, the ones with a tangible sort of content about God would be Rahman Rahim, and it's translated as the all-merciful, all-compassionate, and it denotes a kind of motherly love, the kind of absolute love that a mother has for her children, that fathers do to some extent, but mothers are really proverbial for this. And so isn't that maternal relationship perhaps equally important?
No, not for God. No, you get your idea from God, from your father, because God is a father. This is not just a Christian or Judaic or whatever statement. Apparently, all the anthropological kind of outburst of anthropological study that took place toward the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, delved into all these primitive peoples, and they all found that the more primitive the culture, the more it was monotheistic. And these monotheistic cultures all believed in a father god or a sky god that was not feminine. So there is, Catholicism obviously has this feminine aspect in the Blessed Mother and this aura of femininity and care. But that's not God. There's nothing, in a sense, there's nothing feminine about God. It's a purely if you want to, obviously it is not a being that has sexual characteristics, but if you want to talk about his relationship to the human psychology, it's paternal.
Okay. Well, I would have to do some research and thinking to debate you on that, but I might very well end up wanting to debate you on that someday. In any case, I certainly agree with you about your observations about family dynamics and how that universal problem of harnessing the male energy to take care of the women and children leads to these variations we see on relatively well-ordered and well-parented societies and generations, and then the relatively poorly parented ones. And we seem to be seeing the poorly parented ones coming to the fore now.
Yeah, I think the Father is the reality principle, which has now been taken over by science. So your mother loves you, and pretty much your mother loves you no matter what. But your Father lets you know what's real and how to negotiate reality, and that has been bifurcated into science and religion in our day. Religion has become feminine, and science has taken over that paternal role of telling you what's real or not. And I'm saying that's an untenable situation. The best example, it's not just the United States, it's not just the West, it's the entire world. And the example I gave in the article was basically being in Mumbai and going to the temple of Ganesh, where you worship, and then you go to the Nehru Science Center in the same city where you find out what is real. And you go to the Nehru Science Center, and they have the picture of the universe there in front of you, and the beginning of it is atoms formed. Completely incoherent, okay, metaphysically, but this is a reality that the Indians live with. That's the entire universe. Those are the options for the people, for 1.2 billion people on the face of the earth, and they are completely inadequate.
That's it. Why is it that religion has lost intellectual content so much here? It hasn't so much in Iran. The leading intellectuals in Iran, as we know, are powerfully religious people with a very good philosophical, kind of traditional philosophical background. But we don't really see anything like that here. Because of
because of Darwinism, because of the English ideology and the bifurcation of religion and science, that is basically the legacy of the Enlightenment and the legacy of the internet of the English ideology.
Well, how can these? Yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Well, how can these new atheists be so fanatical about it then? If they really believed what they say they believe, and the universe is completely meaningless, and the only real principle is chance, which they, chance or randomness, which they've elevated to the level of a god, not just a being or a reality, which of course chance is not. Chance and randomness is just our name for certain kinds of processes whose outcome we don't know. That doesn't mean it's in principle necessarily absolutely unknowable. In any case, they've elevated this principle to the level of a god, and then if that's the universe they live in, then obviously it matters not the least what anybody else thinks. If people choose to worship what they call God or worship a cockroach, it makes no difference. I mean, nothing makes any difference. So why would they be so fanatical in pushing this?
Well, first of all, Dawkins does not believe in chance. If you read his book, he's very specific about that. If you believe in chance, then you're up against the problem of complexity and purpose. And Hoyle is the guy, he's an atheist too, but he said basically Darwinism or natural selection is about as probable as a tornado going through a junkyard and assembling a 747. Dawkins absolutely hates that idea, and in order to counter it, he basically turns to natural selection. But after you listen to him for a while, natural selection is his word for God.
Because it would have to be based on chance or randomness, and indeed the Darwinian theory, as I understand, or at least the hardcore neo-Darwinian theory that he espouses, actually is based on chance or randomness. What he's saying is that natural selection operates on random mutations. There is no thought or organizational capacity, creativity, mind, anything like that would steer these mutations in any way, shape, or form. They are simply happening by an utterly random process. And this notion that this utterly random process can give rise to complexity, ultimately he's still supporting that, isn't he? And isn't it self-evidently ridiculous?
No, he's not, because he's saying natural selection is God.
Okay, well, there you go.
That's the God that orders the universe. If natural selection did what he said it did, well, yeah, all men would call it God. That's true. That's right. But we're back to Aquinas' proof for the existence of God here. And he can't do it. It's radically incoherent. He cannot do it because natural selection cannot explain the origin of anything. Natural selection can only act on something which already exists. It cannot bring about the existence of anything. So that's where I guess he's troubled. He's troubled by this, and that's why he gets so agitated over the whole thing, because he knows he can't really prove it. He doesn't believe, he can't really defend it. There was a radio show he was on in England with another atheist, and some man from Scotland calls up and, he starts testifying to what Jesus did in his life, and that they're rolling their eyes. And finally the Scotsman says, well, Richard, was there ever nothing? Well, Richard doesn't know what to say at this point, He says, what if there were ever nothing, then there can't be something, Richard. Well, he doesn't. So Dawkins says, you need to read a book. And then he says, as if that's not bad enough, he says, I wrote 8 books.
Wow.
Well, Richard, just answer the question. Don't tell us to read a book. Answer the question. Well, he can't answer the question because he's out of his depth, because he's trying to make biology into metaphysics or cosmology, and it doesn't work. It can't work. And he exposes this, and I think that's the moment we're living in right now. That's the world moment. You and I are witness to this moment, that this whole Anglo-American, the foundation for the Anglo-American Empire has just crumbled before our eyes. And something new has to emerge to take its place, and that's what I'm proposing here.
And you're saying that this could be essentially universal and unite people of different faith traditions.
Well, why couldn't it? Explain to me why it couldn't. I mean, as I said, the existence of God is an act of, it's an article of reason. It's not a faith. I don't care where you go. If you're talking to someone, you're talking to a rational person. You're talking about logos. You're talking about the fundamental foundation of everything human in logos. Why is that specific to a culture? It's not specific to a culture. We have reached worldwide communication through all the things that I've already mentioned. It's now time to come to some type of worldwide metaphysical understanding of our existence.
Sounds good to me.
Why not? I mean, tell me where I'm wrong here. The fact that we're talking to each other means we are creatures of logos. I'm just saying we need to start extrapolating from that and understanding the implications of it. The fact that God exists, the fact that there is a moral law, the fact that you need the moral law as the underpinning of any type of political system. All of these things are deducible from something that does not require an act of faith.
Well, that seems pretty clear to me, if I understand you correctly, that we're living in a values-based cosmos, that this so-called effort of so-called hard science to take away all values and just see what's there without any merely human values warping what we see was quixotic from the beginning, and that the values go all the way down.
It was dishonest from the beginning, and the man who was the author of this dishonesty was Isaac Newton, who claimed that he didn't frame hypotheses. Hypothesi non fingo, just the facts, man. Well, no, you smuggled a basically pagan ideology into a Christian part of the world, and the way you got away with it was by calling it science. And I'm saying that's over now. If the new atheists have exposed anything, they have exposed the inadequacy of this scientific explanation to explain the world. It cannot do it. You can achieve spectacular effects with it. You can have the Maxim gun at Omdurman, but you can't explain the metaphysical basis of reality. Can't do it.
Well, we're going to have to leave it there because we've hit the end of the hour. But, hey, Mike, it would be great to bring you back and talk some more about various things. I wanted to bring up David Ray Griffin's book, God Exists But God Does Not, which goes off on a totally different tangent from yours, but does offer what many of these people who've lost faith in metaphysics might they'd be forced to agree is pretty strong evidence for the existence of God. But we'll have to save that for another time. But in the meantime, I can just refer people to Culture Wars magazine, where you write. Is there any website you want to plug?
CultureWars.com.
CultureWars.com. There it is. All right. Well, hey, thank you. E. Michael Jones, author of this new article, The Rise and Fall of the New Atheism. It's highly recommended. Like all your work, keep up the good work. God bless.